understanding of what a deep desire is, and on my understanding of
Yeah.
how Brewer understands the notion of a deep desire, a deep desire is a desire that serves as a substratum to all of our other desires.
Mm-hmm.
It underlies all of our other desires. And I want to just link this to the problem of nihilism,
Mm-hmm.
as has been articulated by some Nietzschean types. So, so Robert Pippin, a Nietzschean scholar, defines nihilism as a failure of desire, And I think the idea is something like this. We've got this structure of desire according to which all of our desires presuppose a basic desire for God, and that's fundamental in our motivational makeup. With the death of God, that deep desire is removed so that we're left with something like a bundle theory of desire. And the desires don't connect, they're meaningless. It's just a matter of, as Brewer puts it, a causal weight around, I want this, I want that. We're talking about wants in Iain's sense, I think, at some level. So then the problem of nihilism is the problem of how to reintroduce a deep desire which will keep us going in the way that we want to be going, keep us alive. But, and this is the link with your paper, but in such a way that the desire doesn't come to an end, in the way that it does if we talk about spiritual rest. I mean, I take that phrase from you. So somebody like the Nietzschean wants to use, and again I'm using terminology that they use, want to use the model of something like unrequited love to serve as the model in terms of which to comprehend what it would be to solve the problem of nihilism. And I'll finish in a moment, but the interesting thing to add to this, I think, going back to Iain's paper, is that the kind of model of desire that they want is precisely the model that you get if you understand theism correctly, which is you've got a journey, but at no point does the journey come to an end. So there may well be a notion of spiritual rest, but it's not the kind of rest that the Nietzscheans associate with the death of God, and, that kind of death of desire that they take to be so catastrophic. So I just wonder how that conception of depth relates to what you're wanting to say and to the notion of spiritual rest that you're operating with.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple parts there. So I think that sense especially connects with the view you get from Stump that our deepest desires are at the center of our web of desires, and when we lose sort of the object of that desire, the rest fall apart. So she uses the Yeats sort of expression that the center does not hold, things fall apart, right? And so I think there is sort of a danger when you lose that, and I think she sees that as sort of central to her account of the problem of evil, that when you lose sort of what is your deepest heart's desire, or at least the deeper, the more integral desires, it really has a sort of profound effect on one's life. And I think you see that also at the end with the sort of passages I quoted from Dostoevsky, which I could have argued that point out further perhaps, but the sense that we do need this sort of you might call it sort of a point of philosophical anthropology, that human beings, through a process of moral and perhaps spiritual formation, it's very natural for it to rise that we need some, as Dostoevsky puts it, something to bow before, right? Something to which we're submissive, that it calls upon us to change our lives in some way in responsiveness to it. And so I think that in a way is part of my account, that I think it is true that the deep desires do structure our identity. And if we lose that, right? I mean, I think this is, you get this sense with Nietzsche, with, the death of God passage. It's sort of this vertigo. You experience this vertigo, which way is up, which way is down, and so forth. Yeah, and so then he has to make, he says, we have to sort of become gods to become worthy of this. If we're not going to sort of fall into a kind of nihilism, we ourselves have to become gods. So I think just to the sort of what I see as the first part of your question, I would agree that is part of, I think, the structure of a deep desire, is that it sort of shapes our web of desires or our identity in this sort of very life-defining kind of way.
And that evaluative dimension is crucial to Brewer's account as well. In a sense that it's a basic attraction to something other than something desirable.
But then when he goes on to explicitly define what a deep desire is, he talks about it in terms of something that's sort of beyond our explicit articulation.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think that could be part of it, but that misses, I think, the evaluative picture that's inherent in how we think about.
He has made it absolutely clear that desire is to be understood as this evaluative attraction.
That's right, yeah. But his concept of depth isn't filled out in those terms. So that's what I was saying in that part of the paper, is that so I see myself as very much in line with Brewer's account, that there's this evaluative picture inherent in these desires, but it falls out when he characterizes what it means to speak of depth. Depth is about something that exceeds our capacity for articulation.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that just goes back to Iain's point that the object of the desire cannot be comprehended.
Yeah, and they're often something, of course in the case of God, that's certainly true.
Or another person.
Or another person, but I think when we're talking about, when we appeal to a deep desire as part of clarifying a life orientation, I think it's more the evaluative sense of the depth of this desire. This is a deep desire, it's important. You're trying to characterize something about its importance, rather than its sort of inexplicability, something that we can't sort of fully, or inarticulability, we might say. So I think that certainly often comes into play in these sorts of desires, but it's not what I want to sort of focus on being most key. To the last part about rest, I think this is a really interesting issue. In a way, I think it is part of the structure of desire that we rest in the good. So I think of this passage from Aquinas, where Aquinas says that when we first of all apprehend something as good, right? There's sort of, you apprehend it on the aspect of the good, and then there's a kind of complacency in the object, and then you sort of go forward to sort of obtain that good, which he says ultimately the end point is a sort of a resting in that good, a restful enjoyment. But that doesn't mean it sort of stops, right? There can be a further deepening. And I think it's similar to the case of Sabbath, that Sabbath is sort of a resting from activity, a resting from work. But at least for human beings, we get on with things afterwards. But in a way, Sabbath is a kind of realization of everything. It's that restful delight, right? That really sort of completes the activity. And so I think it's more, I would characterize as a sort of dialectic between activity and passivity, I guess.
I have a kind of worry, and this actually corresponds to a feature of Iain's paper, the idea of being drawn. A desire is that which draws you. But how does a desire have normativity? I mean, except by fiat. And presumably there's a difference between saying that I am drawn to something, or my whole existence is structured around this goal, which is pretty teleological.
Yeah.
But then someone like Stump's going to say, well, no, it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
And you're saying, as I understand, only God has the requisite kind of super-normativity to draw you forward in the right way. But so there's a kind of question of perhaps not just an epistemic question, but how do we identify the right kind of draw, the right kind of normativity?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say that only God can draw us. I mean, I think any sort of strong normative demand would draw us in some way. But insofar as it's a question of what our deepest desire is, which is correlated to what we see as the highest object. So again, in some these are metaphors. I mean, you could use different metaphors, but I think it's a very common way to talk about the depth of a desire being correlated to the height of the object. And so I think, and you see that, I think, in Stump. She talks about this sort of subjective scale of value and this objective scale. And so I think, so the question might be, what does personhood add? And of course, God, there's many persons, right? And it's certainly, I think this is a differentiator. It goes back to some of the discussion from the previous paper about sort of a Buddhist worldview. Presumably a Buddhist, their deepest desire would not be a person. It would be some kind of, I mean, there could be many different ways of, some kind of state of enlightenment or merging with the cosmos, oneness with being, which wouldn't be personal in nature. I mean, it's sort of essentially impersonal. But I think you have to feel, okay, what is it about interpersonal communion, right? I mean, what's the difference, to go back to, I sort of briefly mentioned James. He says, one of the things that is sort of a differentiator of a theistic perspective is that you see the world as a thou rather than an it, right? And so does that add something to see the world as the universe as having its source in a thou rather than an it, rather than some impersonal processes versus the world being a personal order? I mean, in some sense, we can only sort of depend upon our basic responsiveness to these values, that there seems to be a kind of greater depth to that good, right? When it's capable of responding back, when it goes two ways, right? I think to go back to sort of Iain's remarks, that adds something to the goodness, the kind of communion, right? I mean, I think just in our basic experience of loving another person, right? Unrequited love sort of fails to achieve some important good of that intention to love this person, and so I think that's what Stump would have to have in mind, the kind of union that's possible between persons. A communion across persons adds some important good that would otherwise not be there. So I think it'd be along those lines that one would have to fill it out. Then why is God sort of, as a kind of person, at least understood analogically, the highest good, right? Well, I mean, it's hard to, I mean, I would probably go the direction of some kind of perfect being theology, that God was perfect in love, perfect in existence in all sorts of ways, that God is the highest good in just sort of that sense. But those are sort of deep questions, I think.
So there does seem to be a tension between the idea of reciprocity, a reciprocity that confers fulfillment and rest in loving union, and the idea of the open-ended quest, as in perhaps that, what's the word, I've forgotten the correct word for this type of thing.
Well, it's a painting, but I use graphite. Is that what you were trying
Yeah.
to
Yes.
Yeah.
Which seems to lead us forward, in one interpretation leads us forward forever, but without a sort of this is picking up on the feelings, without quiescent reciprocity.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it would maybe again be this idea of a dialectic of desire. You would be desiring the desire of the other, and you would go on in that kind of Trinitarian way. And there wouldn't be a termination to the desire on this model. And I think all of the mystics make that clear as well, that even at the moment of the beatific vision, it's not that you stop desiring, you're somehow caught up in God's desire.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess you'd say you go deeper and deeper into God, I guess, and the hope is that God would go deeper into our lives. So it'd be hard to know what a resting point in that sense would be. I mean, there's certainly, in sort of the beloved, there's a resting, but then there's a continuing, and I think that.
Maybe in a sense that you've somehow transcended the cycle of suffering, to put it in Buddhist terms. So there's a kind of desire which gives no rest.
Yeah, I mean, I would think, to go back to Aquinas, resting would just be the enjoyment of the good. I mean, if you had a love in which you never enjoyed the object of your love, you never just apprehended, right? I mean, there's the love of just apprehension, right? Just appreciating, beholding, right? Rather than seeking to do something. When a lover looks in their lover's eyes, right, there's just a beholding, being with in that sort of way. But I think that kind of love also gives rise to a deepening of the desire.
So it'd be a
right?
satisfaction in desire.
Yeah.
Attraction involving desire to the other person.
Yeah. No, I think that's right.
How you would further characterise the idea of a deep desire as opposed to a strong one or an urgent one, or one that fulfills many functions at once? And also, what would constitute the attainment of the desire for God? I suppose with what I'm really driving at is there could be a subtle religious danger here of instrumentalising God, inasmuch as you might think, okay, why do I desire to marry a rich woman? Well, that solves both my romantic problems and my money problems. Why do I desire a good job? Well, my ego problems, my money problems. Why do I desire God? Well, if I desired and attained God, that would solve all my problems. That would sort of would make my life go right in every possible way, because God would guide me in all the ways. And rather, all I do is find out what He wants and what He's like, and fit myself to it, and ask for His help when I fail, and my life is sorted out. And I suspect that's a sort of temptation, sort of similar for even for religious people. But I also suspect that will constitute a kind of idolatrous instrumentalization of God, and what would be the proper non-idolatrous? Because I imagine someone might think, I desire God more than anything, even if I have to pay with my whole life, even if everything about my life must go wrong for me to attain that desire for God. And even if God is not going to appear at the last minute, as with Abraham and Isaac, and say, it's all right really, even if that's not going to happen, I'm still going to desire God.
Yeah, I think that certainly would be problematic if you instrumental. I mean, it's not clear it would be love then. It would be something else. Be wanting this person to sort of be fix your problems or whatever. Yeah, and I don't tend to think that God. I mean, it's not that God doesn't give a like. I don't think sort of seeking to be at one with God. I mean, I think there is a consolation there. I think Freud wasn't completely off with a sense of existential security or consolation we might seek, but it's certainly, I mean, I don't know any sort of mature religious believer who sort of thinks that sort of seeking to be in relationship with God sort of solves all of your problems. It might make more problems for you. I mean, that's sort of being tormented by God, right? That Dostoevsky speaks about. And I think sort of Dostoevsky is a great case of a certain person who's God-obsessed or God-bedrunken, and it certainly adds a deeper dimension to one's life. I think your first question is about sort of depths of. I mean, partly these are metaphors, and depth, strength. I mean, strength could just be sort of like you just feel it really strong, like it's like. You could talk about strength, and in one sense, a deep desire might just be a really strong one in terms of, the language I used of strong evaluation, that it has a sense of something you ought to do. There's a kind of normative force to it, right? Which, in being responsive to that good that we feel a normative force to, I mean, we're already in it, right? But we might recognize there's some higher object that in most of our lives we're not really living in light of. So we say, no, this desire is much shallower than this other one, which I really ought to be living in light of. So, yeah, I mean, I take it to be metaphors that capture something. They're an image, they capture something important, something. I mean, I think the language of depth does sort of connect, I think, to Fiona's point that it gets down into our identity, to the center of who we are, right? Or it should be at the center of who we are. It's the kind of thing that does make for a kind of fulfillment, although again, maybe the language of fulfillment is problematic in the sense of it could suggest an endpoint, right?
Yeah, and especially if you focus upon that substratum idea again, then you're not remotely tempted to say that on the one hand you've got desire for a person, desire for food, desire for something else, and then desire for God, and then desire for something else, because God isn't an object. And so desire for God isn't a desire that's competing with all of the other desires. It's something that structures all of your desires. And I suppose that's why people like Levinas, for example, want to say you can't desire God directly. You can only desire God by being decent to others, or why Simone Weil says that God has to be on the side of the subject. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a little resistant to the Levinas line. I do want to say that we can desire God, well, I mean, directly as God is, obviously not. If God is an object, it's certainly an object unlike any other object, right? And so there's a certain obvious complexity there.
It'd be like looking for the self in the way that Hume tries to.
Yeah, but I think we do want, I guess I side more of someone like Buber. We want the thou relationship, right? Where it's not, I mean, certainly it can be through our ethical relations with others that we sort of, see ourselves as doing the will of God, or however we might characterize it. But I do want to say that our desire is to be at one with God, and that is a very direct intention. It's not sort of I don't necessarily want to mediate it through sort of just the ethical life, or maybe want to encompass it as sort of at the center of the ethical life, as if we just mean that as how we ought to orient our lives.
It's just with constituent parts of this. I'm going back to Iain's paper again,
Yeah.
and that quote from Eckhart, how,
Yeah.
or Hegel could have said it as well, that the relation between God and self is just so complex, isn't it?
It is complex.
And
That's
it can't be
certainly
imagined
true.
saying you've got the world of selves and then this further entity out there.
Yeah, but I am resistant to saying it's indirect, that we don't, as part of our intention, I mean, like the Augustine, we want to rest in God. That it's a relationship with God. It's not sort of, I want to, it's not like a Spice Girl sort of thing, like if you want to be my lover, you got to get with my friends sort of idea.
I suppose it sounds as if what
Yeah.
you're saying makes the relation indirect.
Yeah.
The assumption that you cling to the idea that God is just another object. In fact, this is the most direct way of relating to God.
Okay.
Given all the incarnation stuff, I don't know.
Yeah.
I see what you're saying as well.
Well, maybe we'll take that one up later. Piers, did I get to the parts of your question? Great, yeah.
Julian.
So just a question about this claim you can find in the theological tradition that
Yeah.
humans in some sense desire God whether or not they realise it.
Yeah.
Is that an empirical claim? Like, if you went to a load of Buddhist monasteries and said, are you satisfied despite the fact that you don't feel yourself to be in personal communion with an ultimate personal reality? And they said, yes, I'm very satisfied.
Yeah.
Or at least, they report themselves just as satisfied as Christian monks report themselves. I mean, would that kind of exercise be missing the point about answering this question, whether all humans have a desire for God? Is it not an empirical question? And if so, what kind of question is it?
Yeah. It depends what we, of course, mean by empirical.
Or
If
you could find out by asking people.
it's not something you could figure out by a survey, no.
And why not? So would it be because somehow this is like an assumption you bring with you when you're going out and asking those Buddhist monks, and therefore you think, well, they must just be wrong about their own internal state of well-being or something, or that unbeknownst to them they're not as satisfied as they could be. But then why would you think that? Is that just because when you yourself intuit that that like you yourself have a desire for God? I mean, it seems difficult to. Yeah,
that would be problematic.
What kind of epistemology are we working with here? Like, how do we know these things?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's not just an empirical survey, just in the way that you wouldn't show that it's wrong to kill someone by taking an empirical survey of whether people think it's wrong to kill someone. I think it requires an exploration of the space of meaning, which is a much more difficult task of how to argue that out. But I think just like in the moral life, and we don't establish moral. I mean, John Stuart Mill tried to do it with higher and lower pleasures. What do most people think? Higher and lower pleasures are if they've experienced both. And I think most people are pretty unconvinced by that sort of argumentative move. But I do think it requires sort of an exploration of the space of meaning to actually engage in religious practices, the religious life, just like the moral life requires a kind of engagement. And so it's exploring that sort of structure of the space of reasons by which you say, okay, what do we have most reason to desire, most reason to orient our lives towards? And of course, that comes up against very interesting interreligious dialogue, right? I mean, some of the sort of, I think, basic disagreement, say, between a theistic worldview and something like a Buddhist worldview, right? Different ultimate world pictures. And so how do you argue that out? I mean, again, I think it's only by sort of appealing to the person, to ourselves, what we're moved by, trying to sort of remove...
How do we generalise what we ourselves are moved by as like some sort of truth applying to all humanity, like a metaphysical truth applying to all humanity, such that, that claims basically that all human beings, whether they know it or not, have this desire for God. But that seems to be a claim about a person's, I guess, construed in a broad sense, a person's psychology. So it's different from the moral kind of issue of like whether it's wrong to kill people, because that is not an empirical claim, at least. not obviously an empirical claim. Whereas whether human beings have a desire,
Yeah.
that looks like it is an empirical claim. You know, you can. It's a fact about the
Yeah.
world, i.e., about human beings.
So I think the sort of linchpin, as it were, to this claim is that we all desire happiness. So I think you get this with Augustine and Aquinas and so all human beings, mature human beings, desire happiness, some sense of their ultimate end, the thing that sort of what they're aiming at in their life as a whole. And with this claim, I think we do form, as Brewer puts it, evaluative pictures of our actions and what we're pursuing. And, in Augustine's life, he comes to what he thinks is a better understanding of that end, right? So we do have this sense of making progress and sort of achieving a better understanding. So I think just as in that intrapersonal case that we feel that we make progress, there's a discovery, right, of what our true good, our highest good is. I think in a similar way, when we engage in sort of interpersonal conversation where people may set very different ends for themselves, right, we have to engage in a similar process of discovery, right, trying to show a person what this picture looks like. So I think it's more about, to use, Cora Diamond makes this contrast between sort of showing and arguing, right? That it's more about trying to show someone a particular way of seeing the world and making that compelling.
E.g., that personal goodness is, someone says the deepest kind of goodness.
Yeah, that there's...
Or that it adds something to it.
I mean, and you might even, as a theist, I might say, look, Buddhists have this idea of compassion or karuna, right? Loving kindness, right? You see the basic impulse there, right? And, well, there's sort of this worry about selfish craving and needing to get beyond the ego, right? Well, maybe we could just say what we need to do is transcend this sort of more narrow, selfish self in towards a wider communion. So maybe in some sense, we're aiming at something roughly similar, but maybe some of the terminology, that sort of the no self, and maybe what we really should mean there is something like a kind of communion, not a sort of merging of the self into this impersonal universe, or however you want to describe it. So I think that's how the argument, a theist and a Buddhist might sort of go about it in that sort of way. Maybe they'd say, well, like Nietzsche says, for instance, that what the theist is really desiring is nothingness when they desire sort of unio mystico with God, right? So Nietzsche sort of interprets this, the sort of nihilistic mode. He thinks the Buddhists were nihilists and Christians are nihilists, and they have the same end, right? That's a different way of construing it, but I think those different construals, those different ways of trying to show the picture maybe in a different light. But I don't think it's an easy sort of that might be empirical in some broader, more general sense than sort of surveys and the like.
I mean, one interesting thing in what Julian said is, do you think it's philosophically contentious to say that we have a deep desire? And just forget about understanding theistic or atheistic. Think about Sartre's version.
Yeah.
Man fundamentally is the desire to be God. And, he's an atheist.
Yeah.
So is it philosophically contentious to suppose that we have a deep desire? Depending, and then we go on to characterise the nature of that desire. And we couldn't determine that empirically, could we? So
could we live at a kind of, could we live in very flat ways, we might say? Is that sort of... I guess that just takes us back to the nihilism point. Yeah.
I'm just trying to be clear about what the issue is here. And maybe it just comes back to the issue that we don't really understand what the desire for God really amounts to, or what a deep desire is. For Sartre, it's a desire that's fundamental to your every motivation and desire. There is this underlying desire to be in ultimate control from his point of view, I suppose, or to have that kind of equilibrium that he associates with God in itself, for itself. Yeah. I think it's... I think if we live without a sense of depth to our desire, it would be a kind of... existential vertigo, because you'd lose a sense of orientation in life as part of what I'm arguing. And so I think about James and the varieties of religious experience. He sort of not only describes conversion experiences where we come to maybe a
a sense of a deeper depth of reality, right? So it's sort of a re-enchanting of things. But he also talks about this sort of flattening that can occur maybe when we have, say, a deconversion experience or some hardship that occurs in our life and nothing really matters. You have that sort of ennui or some sense that all the desires are sort of the same and there's nothing to them. So
yeah, which is the problem of nihilism. So I suppose it's back to the question, can there be a deep desire without God? Which is the Nietzsche's question, isn't it?
yeah, there's deep desires in the sense of a deepest desire, and does it need to be something like God or a God substitute? Something, I mean, I think the Dostoevskian line is that it's sort of as a point of philosophical anthropology, as he puts it, human beings need something to bow before, otherwise they die in despair, right? And I think that's a very provocative claim, right? That we need something to which to bow. And I do think for a time, of course, human beings can live in ways that are sort of not responsive to something like that. But a sort of claim is sooner or later they come up against, maybe in that midlife crisis, what has my life been about? I've been pursuing these various projects. Is there anything of deeper significance in my life? And I think that's a sort of crisis experience, that we don't, the world sort of flattens out and we don't have a sense of life orientation. You sort of lose that sense.
Yeah, I think it's important not to see things too statically.
Yeah.
If we look down on desires, can I empirically or in any other way identify that this is the... I mean, this connects with what Iain was saying about process, the continuing process, that it may be that we can only retrospectively identify what were our truest and deepest desires.
What we've been on about,
Well, not just what we've been on about, but we come to recognise.
Yeah.
Bernard Williams discusses this in that case of he told me he regretted putting in because people kept construing it autobiographically. But it's the case of the person who has an affair.
Okay, yeah.
And he says if this agent ends up going back to his wife, he will retrospectively perceive this affair as an aberration, as a acrasia, as a weakness. But if he decides to subsequently to leave his wife and stay with the mistress, he will retrospectively construe this as an intimation of his own deepest desires and his own truest self. So it's rather like the Freudian idea of Nachträglichkeit, that you retrospect, events at the time carry a charge of significance which is only subsequently interpreted. So it may be that deep or deepest desires can only be understood in the light of where we eventually come to.
I mean, the Williams case sounds a bit more like rationalization, like trying to kind of rationalize after the fact how you got there, rather than a grasping of what you think is a true or evaluative picture. I mean, maybe he meant it that way, but there's the danger that it could just, I mean, from how you sort of put it there, it sounds like it could be sort of a...
Yeah, it may not be it may be a bad
post facto,
example, but it's pointing to a phenomenon I think we all understand, namely that it's often not apparent at the time what represents our own true and deepest.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Ultimately, really, even a hypergood, as Charles Taylor would put it, can actually only be, one's life can only be seen in terms of a hypergood in retrospect. Now, I mean, probably most of us would disagree with that.
Yeah.
For example, God in your picture.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask has probably been overtaken by numerous other questions, which is really to ask you what your argument, which I thought was fascinating and brilliant, what it really showed. I mean, did it show really the need for God, which I'm perfectly prepared to subscribe to, as one of what you're or did it show that we need, these hypergoods, a hypergood or a cluster of hypergoods that, can structure our desires, can form a sort of telos, or the open-ended. I mean, a goal that motivates this yearning for something that isn't sort of immediately instrumentally to hand. So,
that whole phenomenological structure. I mean, to me, your argument points in that direction, certainly. But I wasn't quite sure how it then went on to say, and there's one particular way in which this can be satisfied, in which this can be best exemplified, or, which is the monotheistic God in particular. So, I would ask, well, what about Achilles? What about the life of heroism and renown? I mean, clearly that's a form of life which is valued. How does it point to that? But in a way, your question and others have already covered that ground, so I'm coming late to the question game here.
No, but that seems like a distinct question, I think. I think first of all, I am resisting. One, I think there's just a lack of clarity when there's appeal to deep desires. It's a very common sort of appeal within a religious worldview, within particularly a theistic worldview. So one is sort of an effort of clarification, and I do think the standard way of articulating that has been to say that somehow, as you see in the Stump quote, that they're innate, that they're hardwired into. We have a desire for God hardwired into us, and I just find that picture unconvincing. To say that we're sort of, just for the very fact that God is a very complicated concept, that it's a desire that's conceptually shaped in a very sort of robust sort of way. That, but I think the worry there is that once you make it a matter of some kind of acquisition, conceptual acquisition that has to occur, the worry is that, okay, this could be completely contingent. And I think it does go to Julian's question as well, that, okay, so maybe for you were raised in your Bildung, as it were, your upbringing, your formation was in this context, right? Someone else's was in this different, a Greek person, in ancient Greece, may have been a very different context. And so how do we get from that point, right? How do we go from there to making a case that God really is, whether you're in ancient Greece or whether you're in wherever, here at Heathrow or wherever, that should be seen as the most proper object of your desire, right? And that's sort of the McIntyre quote. I think that's a pretty standard theistic view that that if we know that God exists, we'll know that God is the most adequate object of our love. And that our deepest desire, whether we know it or not, is to be at one with God, right? So I think that requires, partly I think it does go to Julian's question. Some of it's showing, but some of it's just, there's also argumentation, I think, about, so I appealed to earlier sort of aspects of perfect being theology. There's also a sense of what can give sense to the world. I think part of what we are desiring when we desire God is sort of an ultimate source of making sense of things. So does God become a creator God, right? What's the alternative from a religious standpoint to a creator God? Maybe it's just that things are just there. Maybe from a Buddhist perspective, or from Aristotle's perspective, certainly, just sort of the eternality of the world. So the desire for God would look very different in that picture, right? Certainly Aristotle does think in a way that is the deepest desire. Everyone is to be we're sort of propelled into motion by the unmoved mover. I think this is Metaphysics, Book 7, I think, right? So it is an argument, I think, ultimately about perfect being theology. What kind of being is most perfect? And at some level, I would subscribe to, Simon and I, we've talked about this before, but Aquinas talks about being and goodness are convertible, and that has the aspect of desirability. Being is desirable, and God is full actuality. God is a necessary being, not a contingent being, right? And so I think all those sort of moves one might make to try to show if God exists, God would be the most adequate object of our love. That's the sort of argument. I sort of gestured at it. I might just, appeal to standard literature on that. But whether you're ultimately convinced by that, I think is more than just the argument, right? I think one has to come to see the world in that light, and that's. So I don't know if I've established it, but I've tried to point, as it were. So the first point is just to say, what is it for something to be a deep desire in the sense that it provides us with a life orientation, right? And then can we go further and try to make sense of these claims that whether we acknowledge it or not, our deepest desire is to be at one with God. And I tried to at least gesture in that direction. It's a tall order, I think, but I don't. Does that maybe doesn't satisfy? But yeah.
I mean, you would need to enter into a sort of Aristotelian holistic language game in order to get there.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah,
that.
I think that's right. Yeah. Do a fuller reading of Dostoevsky's novels, right? I mean, so I sort of cite some quotes from some passages from Dostoevsky, but I mean, in the course of a life, right? I mean, you might look at Ivan or you might look at Dmitri, right? And see in the course of their lives, how might God sort of be regarded as most properly the deepest desire of their heart, as Stump might put it. But I think it would be something along those. So one would be sort of a kind of philosophical argument, but another would be, I think, appealing to stories, to narratives, to see what a life like that would be like. I think that's something that would have to be part of it.
Brilliant.